Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back at the Manitoba Chamber's AGM, albeit this time virtually. So as was mentioned, I'm Trevin Stratton, the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. For those of you that don't know, the Canadian Chamber is in essence the voice of business in Canada. So we represent a network of over 200,000 businesses from across the country, from every region of Canada, every sector of the economy, all sizes of business as well, from some of Canada's or even the world's largest corporations, all the way down to individual one-person small business. And that, of course, also includes a network of over 450 local and provincial or territorial chambers of commerce, of course, including the Manitoba Chamber. So what I've been asked to do is to provide a bit of an overview of the Canadian economy and the global economy, both in terms of what's been happening during the pandemic, where we're at right now, and what we can actually look forward to as we go ahead, and what might be some of the potential issues we see as well. So first of all, when it comes to the global economy, we're certainly seeing a significant rebound this year, and I'm sure that's probably not a huge surprise to everyone that's attending today. After a historically large economic hit last year in 2020 for the entire global economy, but even if we're kind of looking at splitting it up in advanced economies and also in emerging markets and developing economies, we saw a huge economic decline, historical economic decline, one of the largest basically since the Great Depression. And what we're seeing this year is a new rebound that's going to be taking place. It's already started in some countries. In some countries, it even started last year. But going ahead this year, particularly in the second half of the year, we're looking at very significant growth rates that we actually haven't experienced in Canada or a lot of advanced economies for quite some time. And so as you can see, the global economy last year took a hit of about 3.3% when it comes to real GDP. This year, we're looking at global growth of around 6% and still rather significant growth next year in 2022 as well, over 4% growth, 4.4%. Of course, a lot of the economic downturn last year was concentrated even more so in advanced economies like ours, or the United States, or Europe, or Australia, or Japan. And so we saw a 4.7% decline last year, but this year we're looking at a rebound that will, basically make up for most of that. Looking at 5.1% growth rate this year, and also 3.6% next year as well. And then similarly, when it comes to emerging markets, a bit less of a hit last year. But if we're looking at global growth, it's really going to be driven this year more so by emerging markets and developing economies than by advanced economies. And this isn't necessarily anything new. This is a trend that we saw well before the pandemic as well, with emerging markets driving growth. But those high growth rates are going to continue well into 2022 as well. Over 5% growth in emerging markets and developing economies are projected for that period as well. Certainly when we're looking at some of these numbers, something important to keep in mind are the risks involved, even apart from the growth rates. And when we're looking at not as much emerging markets, but developing economies in particular, but also including emerging markets, that there are higher risks when it comes to potential debt crises resulting from the pandemic, and certainly something to keep in mind that can potentially derail some of these projections. If we're looking at it more on a regional basis around the world, certainly you can see a few differences taking place. Really, the region of the world where we're going to see the highest growth rates, or we're going to see driving growth, are emerging markets and developing markets in Asia. This year, looking at over 8.6% growth. Which is huge, of course. And of course, even the year afterwards, looking at 6.6% growth. But even as we look across the world or across the globe, we're seeing rather significant growth rates in every single region going forward, which is, of course, good news to many people that are attending today, and just businesses in general, is being able to get out of this and into the rebound. And even more specifically, when we're looking at emerging and developing Asia, one of the largest economies in the world, but also one of the first economies to recover, being China. China was the only major economy in 2020 that even saw growth last year. that's going to continue to drive growth going forward. If we really zero in on the advanced economies, and I'll get to Canada in a second, we see, of course, significant growth rates going forward. But what we also see is that, some of those countries that took huge hits last year, maybe more so than others in advanced economies, France, Italy, Spain, the UK, obviously, to a certain extent as well. We're seeing a bit of a recovery for them this year and beyond as well. One of the perhaps mitigating factors might be what happens with the tourism industry. And so some of those hardest hit countries or hardest hit economies, France, Italy, Spain, UK, have very significant large tourism industries. And so looking at the actual rebound for that sector, that might be a bit longer, or it's still somewhat uncertain as well. Now, something that we saw during the pandemic is a reversal in many ways of many years of global economic connectedness. So, over the span of many decades, basically since the end of the Cold War, we saw an increase in global economic connectedness when it comes to global trade patterns, global capital flows, global labor mobility, global supply chains. And we saw a reversal of this during the pandemic. Some people might say that it actually slowed down even before the pandemic. Some might say 2008, some might say 2016. But certainly what we saw, at least during the pandemic, is at least an acceleration of de-globalization, if you will, or global fragmentation. So here we have some data based on delivery times, in particular for manufacturing. And as you can see, there are quite a few countries that are experiencing slower deliveries when it comes to the global supply chain. And one of the questions going forward, of course, will be at what pace does this recover going forward as well? Going to be a very important question. And even apart from supply chains, certainly looking at global trade, looking at global capital flows, how much will this rebound afterwards? Or is this kind of global fragmentation of the economy that we saw going to be a bit more prolonged? And there may be some indications out there, obviously when it comes to some protectionist policies in some countries focusing very much on the domestic economy. This is going to be a big question for the global economy going forward as well. And this, of course, also impacts Canadian businesses too. And so this is from the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce does in collaboration with Statistics Canada. And we see businesses concerned with future supply chain challenges, and they, because of that, in many ways are planning to diversify their domestic and international supply chains. Something to keep in mind is that this isn't necessarily equal across sectors. And so, we certainly might see moves towards more domestic or regional supply chains when it comes to sectors like agriculture or potentially like manufacturing. But there are differing aspects that take place across sectors. And similarly, when we're looking at this reversal, it's not necessarily going from global supply chain or global economic connectedness to national ones. It can actually be going from global supply chains more to regional ones, North American supply chains, Asian supply chains, European supply chains. And this is something, one of those variables that's still out there that we're not exactly sure how it will play out. Now, this I find, very fascinating, is that we see a very big difference when it comes to the goods producing sector and the services producing sector when it comes both to the economic downturn, but also to the pace of recovery as well. So if you look at the top left-hand graph, you'll see, goods trade took just as big of a hit as the service sector at the beginning of the pandemic, but has almost completely recovered now. When it comes to global trade in goods. While if you look at the services trade, it certainly has not recovered to the same extent as the goods trade. And this is a very interesting aspect of the pandemic because it's actually reversing what had taken place before that, and I'll get to that in a second. Similarly, if we look at the top right-hand graph, this has global manufacturing and services PMI, and if we actually look at the manufacturing sector versus the services sector, we see that the manufacturing sector took less of a hit and is also closer to being back towards its pre-pandemic level, while services took much more of a hit and once again hasn't recovered as much as well. If we're looking at international tourist arrivals, of course, tourism being a service industry, and one of the ones that has been hardest hit during the pandemic as well. If we're looking at tourist arrivals, really, taken a precipitous drop and has not actually been able to recover anywhere near where it was pre-pandemic thus far. And finally, in the bottom right-hand graph, what I really want to show you is that prior to the pandemic, from 2010 to 2019, the actual growth in exports of goods and services went more towards the service sector. So actually, a lot of the growth we saw in exports prior to the pandemic was in services, while during the pandemic, what we've seen is that the service sector has actually taken much larger of a hit and is taking longer to recover. And so this is quite a big reversal of a global economy trend that we've seen over the past decade and a bit. Of course, Canada is operating in this type of international environment. And when it comes to those promising growth projections, Canada is not an exception. We have been able to actually recently revise our growth outlook for this year and beyond. It's better than was initially projected. Initially, in the first quarter of this year, it was projected that Canada would actually take a bit of an economic hit, that our economy would decline in the first quarter of this year. That does not appear to be the case anymore. And particularly in the second half of this year, looking at very significant levels of growth going forward, which is, of course, good news for many businesses, I'm sure, that are watching here today. But of course, that's not going to be even across sectors or across types of businesses too. And so when it comes to our economic growth rate this year, we're the most recent, this is from the Bank of Canada, projections are around 6.5% GDP growth this year. This is the largest, significant piece of growth annually that we've seen in quite some time. That's huge. But even beyond that, even after the initial rebound this year, and I'll get to some of the reasons or drivers for that in a second, we're still seeing significant growth levels in 2022 and 2023, 3.7, 3.2% growth. These are very high levels of growth in Canada that we haven't seen for quite some time. And of course, this is very good news. What might be where some questions might arise is what are the drivers of growth? And as you can see from this table, there are different types of growth or different reasons why our economy grows: consumption, housing, government spending, business investment, exports. And when we're looking at this year, we see consumption driving growth, followed up by housing and the extraordinary amount of government spending that we're doing as well, with business investment really pulling up the rear. And so this is a longer term trend than just during the pandemic of seeing lower business investment. But this, of course, should be a concern for many policymakers and business leaders out there too. And one of the big questions is how do we actually spur business investment to be a greater driver of growth going forward? And so I mentioned, housing. Obviously, we're seeing a huge amount of growth in that sector right now. And this is in part, builders are responding to demand, and there definitely is greater demand for housing arising from a number of different reasons, certainly having to do with a lot of people just spending more time in their homes, being part of it, and an increase of value placed on that. Definitely having to do with very low interest rates as well, of course. And so what we actually have seen when it comes to the housing growth and builders trying to keep pace, though, of course, with the what's going on with the lumber industry right now, that might potentially slow at some point soon, is that we're actually seeing house prices rising more rapidly outside of city centers. And this, of course, might have to do with working remotely for some people or some different types of organizations, and just new opportunities, not necessarily where you need to live closer to the city center to have those anymore. And so when we look at kind of major urban centers across the country, we actually see home prices rising outside of the center itself, which is an interesting trend, and we'll see if that continues going forward as well. Of course, I mentioned that consumption is supposed to be the leading driver of Canadian growth this year. And there are a few reasons for that. One of them, or one of the main ones, being the amount of savings that Canadian households have actually accumulated during the pandemic. Some of this, of course, has to do with increases in disposable income, and some of it has to do with just less spending or expenses, and also just less opportunities to consume with a number of restrictions put in place as well. And as you can see, this kind of share of accumulated savings is more concentrated in the higher income quintiles, and less so in the lower ones. So that's very important to keep in mind too. Of course, those higher income quintiles are usually the demographics that end up driving consumption too. And so that's very important to keep in mind. But what we're seeing is that, for instance, the most recent survey on consumer expectations is that most Canadian consumers are expecting to spend a lot more in the second half of this year when the health aspects of the pandemic subside, even though their wages and salaries will not be increasing. So a lot of Canadians are planning on spending, in other words, these accumulated savings that they have built up during the pandemic. And that's what a lot of economists like myself, you have us kind of talking about pent-up demand in the economy, that there is kind of a lot of demand in the economy that's ready to be released once the pandemic subsides in the second half of this year. And of course, we see that when it comes to business sentiment as well. So this is the Bank of Canada's latest business sentiment survey. And as you can see, business sentiment has increased significantly over the past quarter. And a lot of businesses are, looking at the second half of this year as opportunities for economic growth going forward. What's really interesting, though, is that you'll actually start to see an uptick in business investment, right? A small one nonetheless, but still businesses, because they're anticipating increases in consumer demand, better economic conditions in the second half of this year, they're starting to invest again, which might be at least some good news when it comes to those flagging business investment levels that we previously talked about, but also speaks to that point about pent-up demand in the economy too, and so a lot of businesses are certainly taking that into account. Now, what we find really interesting is what businesses have been investing in during the pandemic, and also their plans for investments going forward too. And so we've definitely seen a lot of businesses invest in technology. And as I'm sure many of you know, Canada has historically had a few problems with our productivity levels. So our productivity, for instance, compared to the United States, has always been historically lower than the United States, but it's even started diverging more since around 2011. And in some ways, that's because businesses have not been investing in technology in the same way that, for instance, American companies have been. During the pandemic, we've seen quite a few businesses invest in new technologies. And as a result, our productivity levels in Canada have increased during the pandemic, as they have in many comparable countries around the world too. So we've seen about 1/3 of businesses have adopted cloud solutions. About 1/4 of businesses have adopted collaboration tools, in particular for remote work. About 1/4 of businesses have adopted security software tools, of course, when it comes to security with remote working as well. And so, we see this kind of adoption of remote technologies in kind of those tertiary sectors that don't rely as much on physical presence, like finance, insurance, information industries, professional, scientific, and technical services. What's very interesting to me is that while we see quite a bit of business investment in technologies that assist with remote working and just with adapting to the pandemic itself, we haven't seen a very large uptick in other aspects of technology that could certainly have a very positive long-term impact on Canadian productivity levels. So we haven't seen a huge uptick in businesses investing in artificial intelligence, businesses investing in machine learning, a bit more businesses investing in automation, but still not a huge amount. And that's very interesting because we see a number of businesses investing in remote working technologies, which can improve productivity, but investing in those things like artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, that will certainly play a role in many industries of the future, no matter what industry you're in. We haven't necessarily seen that in Canada just yet. And actually being able to create investment in those areas for businesses will be very important for Canada transitioning to an increasingly intangibles economy as well. And so, very, very important kind of data coming out of this from the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions too. Of course, not all businesses have the luxury of being able to use technology to adapt to the pandemic. And this is what economists like me call, a K-shaped recovery. There are some sectors that have been able to adapt to physical distancing, to remote work, particularly through the use of technologies. And so, they have actually been able to, remain in operation, been able to, in some cases, even grow, depending on the sector during the pandemic, by just adapting to this new environment. For many other businesses, the businesses that are the hardest hit during this pandemic, that's just not an option because they exist in high contact service sectors. So we're talking about the hardest hit sectors like restaurants and food services, like retail, like the arts, and these sectors are very much at the whim of the restrictions that are put in place, and this has obviously had a different impact on these types of businesses during the pandemic. And so here we have that kind of data looked at in a different way too. And so as you can see, some of those sectors, agriculture in particular, real estate in particular, finance and insurance, have actually been able to rebound even more than their pre-pandemic levels, to this point in many ways through being able to adapt. Retail to some extent, there obviously are a lot of retail businesses that have started using e-commerce and have been able to adapt in that way. But if we look at, some of the businesses that really haven't been able to get back to normal because of what's taking place in the economy and because of the pandemic itself and restrictions, accommodation and food services, arts and entertainment are really taking a big hit, and are the businesses that are most in need of and using some of those emergency supports, and will probably be the sectors that will have a much longer timeline for recovery as well. And so this kind of story of diverging economic realities is certainly unfolding in some of these impacted sectors, but they actually seem to have accelerated in recent months too. So this is from Q1 this year. And so, when we're looking at kind of the top three most impacted sectors, they are once again facing restrictions. And so, any rebound that they initially saw maybe back last year, that this has them concerned quite a bit right now too. When we're looking at kind of the least impacted sectors, finance, insurance, real estate, agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, they've, as I mentioned, have actually grown during the pandemic. But we've actually seen some sectors that are kind of in the middle that have started to recover. So sectors like manufacturing, like mining, quarrying, oil and gas, and energy industry, and part of that, of course, has to do with energy prices and what's happening there. They took a relatively large hit, not as big as the worst sectors, but a pretty big hit at the beginning of the pandemic. But they have actually been able to start rebounding quite a bit. When it comes to energy, prices has to do with it. When it comes to manufacturing, that's one of the sectors where we've seen an increase in automation, and of course, many manufacturing companies also retooling in many ways too. And so this has been an interesting new development, and certainly speaks to those not only high performing sectors during the pandemic, but kind of those middle sectors being able to drive recovery and seeing those high growth rates going forward in the second half of this year. Now, when we're looking at jobs, there have, first of all, it's a similar story when it comes to sectors. The job losses and jobs not coming back are in those hardest hit sectors that I was just mentioning. And so that's where a lot of the support is really focused. But there are other ways to slice it, of course, too. And so I'm sure many of you have heard about the impact on women in the workforce during the pandemic. And certainly we've seen, a hit across the board, but women not necessarily being able to recover to the same extent as men in the workforce just yet. And so this is why there is so much focus on childcare in this year's federal budget to ensure that there aren't longer term labor market scars when it comes to women in the workforce. And then also, if we're looking at wage levels, is that employees in lower wage occupations are the ones that lost more jobs and that haven't been able to recoup as many as employees in higher wage jobs. And so many of those sectors that are hardest hit also have a greater proportion of lower wage employees. And so that's a bit of a divergence that we're seeing in terms of our economic recovery and our job market recovery as well. Now, what's interesting is that many businesses plan to invest in their current workforce looking ahead, rather than necessarily hiring for new skill sets. And so this is a very interesting development. Many businesses are not necessarily expecting to increase the size of their workforce in the next few months, but businesses, are nearly 2 times as likely to develop skill sets of their current workforce than hire new staff or contractors. And of course, some of that will have to do with significant reskilling and upskilling initiatives that will be taking place in the Canadian economy and amongst businesses going forward too. Now, if we're talking about the fiscal picture, we have obviously spent a very significant amount of money during the pandemic. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Our national debt is now $1.4 trillion, which is of course an astronomical number. What we saw in the budget as well, this year's federal budget, is spending, of course, in over $100 billion going forward in terms of the economic recovery plan too. And so this is going to be, a challenging edge to walk between ensuring that we put in place the right type of fiscal and monetary supports to drive a recovery and drive growth going forward, while also in many ways not necessarily creating problems when it comes to this extraordinary amount of debt that we've racked up, or necessarily creating problems when it comes to inflation too. And so this is going to be a bit of a tightrope that not only the Canadian government, all governments, around the world are going to have to really figure out going forward. What we're seeing right now, this is one of the reasons why many members of the business community, including the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, has been so focused on governments putting in place the policies for long-term competitiveness. What we're seeing right now is that we can expect an economic rebound later this year, and that will have nothing to do with government's economic policies. It will have everything to do with getting the pandemic under control. Once we are able to address the health aspects of the pandemic, there's a lot of pent-up demand in the economy that is ready to be released and will really just drive very high growth rates in terms of an immediate economic rebound. And so that's why a lot of economists are saying we don't necessarily need short-term stimulus spending. We don't necessarily need to stimulate the economy. The economy will be stimulated by the pandemic getting under control. If we are going to spend money, it should be more on the longer term aspects of economic competitiveness. It's to ensure that an initial rebound can actually translate into longer term growth and longer term jobs and longer term competitiveness going forward. And certainly there were some aspects in the budget that focused on that. A focus on reducing interprovincial trade barriers, a focus on doing regulatory reviews to help assist businesses with the regulatory burden that exists within Canada, funding going towards trade enabling infrastructure, things like that. What will be very important is that when it comes to regulatory reviews, when it comes to reducing interprovincial trade barriers, that is not just committees and reports that are created and sit on shelves, but that it actually leads to tangible action that will help businesses and help make our economy more competitive going forward. But then, of course, there are many aspects of spending in the budget too, where they might not have the greatest return on investment of tax dollars when it comes to economic growth and when it comes to job creation going forward. And so really managing that is going to be very important. As I'm sure many of you saw, the federal government's deficit is projected to decline going forward every year from now, which is of course good news. It's a plan to hopefully manage the deficit. Of course, that relies on a few things. First of all, that our growth projections are correct, and that's why we need to have such a laser focus on growth. Secondly, that our interest rate assumptions are correct when it comes to those budget and deficit projections, and that will be an interesting question going forward too. And also that that there isn't any more significant government spending, because obviously that will affect our deficit position in future years if a lot more spending is announced in next year's budget or the year after that too. And so these are very important factors to keep in mind. And one of the big question marks in Canada and elsewhere is, of course, what's going to happen with prices and what's going to happen with inflation. I think a lot of people probably take it for granted because we haven't experienced, worrying levels of inflation for quite some time in Canada since the 90s. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this in the 80s too, with what we're seeing when it came to price rises. And so it'll be very important. We're looking right now at significant inflation over the short term, over the next few quarters, but then that is supposed to peter out afterwards, partially because of the economic slack that exists in the economy going forward too. But if this changes, if that inflation rate actually does end up being more prolonged, then in many ways, central bankers are going to be in between a rock and a hard place of trying to keep interest rates low to have those high growth rates, yet at the same time maybe needing to raise interest rates to address higher prices. And of course, the question being, what happens to all of this government debt, household debt, consumer debt that we have racked up during the pandemic if interest rates start to rise? And so with that, I will leave it to the rest of the discussion to talk about some of the policy issues that have been involved when it comes to Canada's economic recovery. And have a great day, everyone.